Welcome back to Combat Mission, where we're going to take a look at Allied half-tracks from World War II. This means American half-tracks, because the other two big industrial participants on the Allied side, Britain and Commonwealth, and the Soviet Union, either bought them from the United States or were supplied with them via Lend-Lease. They didn't really build their own. So just like normal, we're going to quickly go over some of the history. What is a half-track? What's it for? And then dive into the different types, of which there's quite a few, before finishing off with how to get the most out of them. Fundamentally, a half-track is a truck. It retains its front wheels for steering, but it ditches the rear wheels in favour of tracks. This means that you have a truck with much enhanced off-road ability, and from a military perspective where you need to be going off-road quite a lot, this has some obvious utility. It has even more obvious utility when you consider armoured combined arms warfare. It's all well and good having tanks that can race off across muddy fields without worrying too much about getting bogged down or struggling to power their way forward, but tanks can't operate effectively on their own. They need infantry protection, they need artillery support and forward observers, they need scouts for reconnaissance, they need anti-aircraft cover, they need maintenance crews, they need someone to bring them fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, replacement bodies, and so on and so on. So the half-track, a truck that can keep up with the tanks when they go off-road, is a pretty good solution. It's got some disadvantages. Tracks require much more maintenance than wheels, for example, but they're good enough. And this, combined with ease of manufacture and training, as well as we're going to see, its capacity to have all kinds of things stuck on it, meant that everybody got a lot of use out of them. The United States, with the luxury of oceanic isolation, had more time than everyone else to prepare for war, but this also meant that they had to fight at the end of extremely long supply chains, leading the US Army to look for and develop weapons, vehicles, and equipment that were first and foremost mechanically reliable. This means that it was looking for designs that used existing components and parts, designs that were more iterative than innovative, and designs that were well suited to mass manufacture. The story of the US Army's World War II half-tracks starts off with the M1 White Scout Car, as designed and produced by the White Motor Company. This was pretty much a civilian truck with a lightly armoured body, an already established commercial design repurposed for military use. It was first tested in 1934, and while World War II and the prospect of intercontinental warfare was way over the horizon at this point, the US Army in the 1930s was strapped for cash, and it was going to be a lot cheaper to buy and maintain proven vehicles that had pre-existing production lines. The White Motor Company doubled down on this successful approach with the later M2 and M3 White Scout cars, by making sure they incorporated a lot of existing parts and components already in use in other vehicles. By 1938, they had made their first foray into half-track design, taking the already established M3 Scout car and swapping the rear wheels for the track system from the also already established T9 half-track truck. This resulted in the T7 half-track car, which struggled a bit with engine power. Soon enough though, the White Motor Company had whacked an improved engine in and submitted the design to the US Army in response to their request for a new artillery prime mover. The US Army liked it. Again, it wasn't some kind of risky technological leap forward, it was an iterative design that built and improved on what had come before. It became the M2 half-track car, and it wasn't long until it had been stretched into the longer M3 half-track for armoured infantry use, after which, with a solid, reliable platform established, the US Army did what all armies do when they find a platform they like, and they started bolting anything and everything to it to fit into a wide range of battlefield roles. We're only going to be dealing with the Allied half-track variants actually present in Combat Mission at the time that I'm recording. And because they're all essentially different versions of the M2, we can start off by going over some common or baseline characteristics. Somewhat ironically, the half-track's most important feature, its mobility, is quite difficult to quantify in a useful fashion. The fact that an M3A1 can go 800 meters on a paved road, 640 on a dirt track, 570 on plain dirt, and 540 on plain grass, on the flat with dry ground conditions in July of 1944 when no one is shooting at it, is a little over-specific and artificial. not only are these exact circumstances relatively unlikely to crop up, but some of the key under-the-hood differences between the variants involve increasing the weight of the vehicle or incorporating a different engine, both of which would also alter things like speed quite significantly. So it seems better to present the half-tracks relatively. Compared to other common vehicles of the Western Allies, the half-track is faster off-road than Shermans and 2.5-ton trucks. This is kind of something that you just have to get used to and eyeball. And if you're doing something that relies on the speed of the half-track, some good advice is always to go and test it first. In terms of protection, most variants of half-track use the same body, which has 6 to 12mm of armour. This is enough to protect against submachine gun fire and some shrapnel, but that's really about it. Square-on hits from rifle rounds, whether fired from Kar-98Ks, G43s or M242s, will reliably create spalling and partial penetrations out to 500 meters, and by the time the range is close to 200 meters, your average German infantry squad is easily capable of turning a half-track into a stylish, if somewhat impractical, colander, with fatal results for the Pixeltruppen inside. The effects of enemy small arms fire can be mitigated somewhat by angling, which increases the effective thickness of the armour, and the half-track is a little less vulnerable from the front, simply because the engine is capable of intercepting incoming fire before it hits the squishy Pixeltruppen inside. Overall though, it's generally best to avoid getting shot at if possible, not least because anything bigger and nastier than a rifle round will do terrible things to any half-track it hits. As a final caveat on protection, the half-tracks are all open-topped, so anything poking above the line of the armour, like the top half of the gunner or the heads of the passengers, has no protection whatsoever, and the lack of an armoured roof also makes the vehicles extremely vulnerable to anything falling on it from above, like plunging small arms fire, hand grenades, mortar bombs, artillery shells, and everybody's favourite, ignited flamethrower fuel. With regards to shooting back at the enemy, the Allied half-tracks are usually armed with machine guns, either one or more 30 caliber M1919A4s or a single 50 caliber M2 on a variety of different mounts. These are both very common weapons for the US Army. In short, the M1919A4 is a medium machine gun which uses the same ammunition as the M1 Garand in 250 round belts. This MG is the less common armament for half-tracks, but because it has that ammunition compatibility, it can use the stocks of 30 caliber M2 ammunition stored in the back of the vehicle for infantry use, of which there are several thousand rounds, so you can keep these MGs firing pretty much as you like. It's effective against infantry and unarmoured vehicles like Cuba wagons and trucks, out to about 500 meters and capable of getting rounds out to a good 1,000. The M2 Browning is a much more impressive piece of kit. Compared to the M1919, it has less ammunition, usually about 700 rounds in 100 round belts, but the 50 caliber round is considerably more powerful than the 30 caliber. Lightly armoured vehicles like German half-tracks and scout cars are easy prey, and sustained fire on tanks is capable of wrecking those external subsystems like optics and radios, as well as punching through buildings and generally ignoring most forms of cover. They can engage targets out to 2,000 meters, but as usual with long ranges in combat missions, the chances of actually having a clear field of fire out to that distance are pretty slim. One of the reasons that the US Army was slapping 50 caliber MGs on everything was air defense, but in combat mission it seems that only specifically designated anti-aircraft weapons will engage enemy planes. The gunners on non-AA half-tracks will happily sit there scanning for ground targets while the Luftwaffe strafes the snot out of them. This is not ideal, but at the same time it's something of an edge case because the Luftwaffe doesn't show up very often outside of the early war. It's also important to bear in mind that the MG gunners in these half-tracks have to expose themselves to fire. They don't have any gun shields or other armour protection, and they will just stand there in the fire until they get shot or decide to abandon the weapon and sit down, so the gunners are very vulnerable to enemy small arms fire. If the half-track has more machine guns than it has gunners, then these weapons will be manned by the passengers. In both cases, the gunners won't get up and man their weapons unless you give them the open up command or they spot something they feel like shooting at. Something to bear in mind with this is that any passengers who are opened up will stand up in the back and fire over the sides, so Yes, drive-bys are possible, and yes, as usual, they are a terrible idea if the enemy is in any state to shoot back. Rounding out the details, the half-tracks usually have a base crew of 2, driver and gunner. They are all equipped with radios, and pixel truppen have a couple of ways of getting out. Again, the half-track is basically a fancy kind of truck, so there's a door on either side of the cab, and everybody else gets out by using the rear door or piling over the sides. Internal stowage and what the half-track is carrying can vary between roles in ways that make sense. So infantry carrier half-tracks carry a lot of small arms ammunition, and the American vehicles all have bazookas in the back that can be acquired by the passengers. Half-tracks being used by anti-tank gun platoons have extra anti-tank gun ammunition stowed away, but they're only available as part of mechanized anti-tank gun formations. You can't get half-tracks with extra AT gun ammo from the single vehicles tab, you have to get them by bringing the right anti-tank platoon along. One interesting feature that I'm sure has no bearing on combat mission whatsoever is this drum on the front of the vehicle. I always assumed that this was some kind of poorly textured winch, but it's actually an unditching roller that helps to stop the nose of the half-track digging into the side of trenches and ditches. Finally, the half-tracks are capable of towing things like AT guns and on-map artillery, providing there's enough space in the back for the crew. With the common characteristics out of the way, we can get on to the variants, and because this is the US Army we're dealing with here, I hope you like the letter M. The first variant is the original, the M2 half-track. There is space for 8 passengers, but it doesn't have a rear door yet. Armament is one 50 caliber MG on a skate mount above the cab, meaning that it is restricted to the half-track's frontal arc, and one M1919A4 on a pintle mount at the back, which will have to be manned by the passengers, though again the placement of the mount restricts the MG's field of fire to the rear. The M3 is the same thing, except it's been lengthened a bit so you can fit a total of 12 passengers in, or a full US infantry squad. And now a rear door has been added so they can get in and out a bit more easily. There are 3 versions with slightly different weapons layouts. The M3 has a pedestal mounted M1919A4 in the centre of the vehicle. This is a bit better than the skate mount because it's got a full 360 degree traverse. The M3 2xMG is exactly what it says on the tin. To go along with the central pedestal mounted M1919, there's another on a pintle mount next to the rear door, just like the M2. Then there is the M3 M2HB, which, unsurprisingly, replaces the pedestal M1919 with the 50 caliber. From here, we go to the A1 variants, so we have the M2A1 and the M3A1. These are both armed with 50 caliber MGs on a ring or pulpit mount over the cab, so now the gunner has full 360 degree field of fire without tripping over the legs of the passengers in the back. He also has marginally more armour around him, but that's probably just going to make him feel better. Those are the half-tracks of the US Army. Other variants that perform the same function for the British and Commonwealth forces are the M5, M5A1 and the M9A1, which are essentially the same as the M3, M3A1 and M2A1 respectively. These vehicles have slightly thicker armour and different engines, but the practical differences in a combat mission sense are pretty negligible. All of these variants are used for carting infantry or anti-tank guns about. The other variants are more specialised and geared towards specific roles. We have anti-air vehicles, a tank destroyer, a self-propelled gun, and some mortar carriers. The simplest in combat mission terms are the AA half-tracks, the M15 and M15A1 combined gun motor carriage, or CGMC, and the M16 multiple gun motor carriage, or MGMC. Both of these vehicles have the rear compartment cut down so they can fit new weapon systems in, but this means they can't fire forward because they would hit the cab. The M15 and M15A1 are essentially identical. The A1 is just a later production model. It has a bit of a weird main armament, a centrally mounted 37mm autocannon with an M2 50 caliber MG on each side. The 37mm fires at a pretty steady rate and comes with 160 rounds of HE ammunition and 40 rounds of armor piercing. This is the downside of larger caliber weapons. You're only going to get a few turns worth of area fire due to the low ammo count. What it can put out is very effective though. Don't forget that at the start of the war, a 37mm AT gun was pretty much state of the art. Sustained fire will knock holes in buildings and bring them down, infantry out in the open will have a bad time, and light vehicles like half-tracks and trucks will get collared. Tanks are less vulnerable, especially to the front, but flanking shots are able to punch through the armour of Panzer IVs, and as always, even if the rounds don't penetrate, you can always be doing some external damage to those subsystems on the outside. However, the chances of the enemy letting you just plink 37mm cannon shells at them without firing back is pretty low, and like all the half-tracks, the M15 does not react well to getting shot back at. It also has the twin 50s with 1200 rounds between them, so it's capable of useful anti-infantry work when the cannon has run dry. The crew consists of a commander and driver up front in the cab, then 5 men on the actual weapons platform aiming, firing and reloading the guns. The whole platform rotates, having a pretty good field of fire despite missing a chunk for the cab, and it does have some armour plating to protect the gun crew, though this is lower at the front because of the weird armament layout, so getting shot at by things that you're shooting at is probably not a good idea. The M16 multiple gun motor carriage is very similar, except it's armed with 4 50 caliber MGs in the M45 quad mount. This is a reasonable amount of DACA, though obviously not enough, and it has plenty of ammunition. Each gun uses a 200 round tombstone drum, and the vehicle carries over 4,000 rounds in total. It is somewhat less awkward than the combination 37mm dual 50 mount on the M15, so it needs fewer crew, commander and driver in the cab again, then a gunner in the actual quad mount itself, and 2 loaders. Unlike the M15, the loaders aren't sitting on the weapon mount, so they won't rotate with it. Again, we have similar firing angles, but even though it looks like the quad 50 should be able to shoot over the cab, it can't. The primary role of these variants is obviously anti-air work, and it's quite difficult to judge how effective they are at this due to the way that Combat Mission handles aircraft. Actually hitting and shooting down enemy aircraft is always pretty rare. The real benefit lies in putting enough lead into the air to put the pilot off, making them miss or cancel their attack runs. In any case, the Luftwaffe aren't exactly regular participants in combat mission games, so chances are you're going to be using them to engage ground targets more often than aircraft. Next up we have the M3 GMC, or gun motor carriage. This was a kind of stopgap tank destroyer that the Americans churned out before they received the M10, and as such it's more of a mid-war vehicle that falls out of US service pretty quickly in combat mission terms. The British still have some hanging around in their armoured car regiments in Market Garden, but by 1944 it's been effectively replaced by much better vehicles. The GMC is best thought of as a self-propelled anti-tank gun. The actual main weapon is the M1897A4 75mm gun, which is an American-produced French 75 of 1897 that famously saw use in the First World War, and was the first field gun to have hydraulic recoil absorption, allowing a faster rate of fire and much more effective indirect fire. This was the US Army's main artillery piece up into the 1930s, and when it was replaced by the 105mm howitzer, they had a lot of these guns hanging around, so it didn't take long for someone to decide to stick it to a half-track. Despite its age, the M1897A4 is not a bad anti-tank gun. It actually uses the same 75mm ammunition as the Sherman, and it's capable of penetrating Panzer IVs from the front at 500 meters. It carries 28 rounds of AP, 28 rounds of high explosive, which again is the same ammo used in the Sherman, so it's pretty effective, and 3 smoke rounds. Unlike the rest of the half-track, the gun shield is actually bulletproof, though the commander does poke his head over it to see, and as usual actually getting shot at is generally something to be avoided, especially if the vehicle is opened up, because the driver will put the armour plate windscreen down and get himself shot in the face. The major downsides are the restricted firing angles. The gun has pretty limited traverse to the front, so most of the aiming involves pointing the half-track in the right direction. The size of the vehicle is another problem. It's actually quite comparable in length and height to the M10 that replaces it, except that the M10 has a better gun and more armour. This is a problem when you go tank hunting because being small and hard to notice is a serious advantage. The M3 has a crew of 5, driver in the front, 3 men working the main gun, and 1 to man the pedestal mounted 50 cal at the back. The GMC only carries 300 rounds for the 50 cal MG, but it's really just the weapon for when things go disastrously wrong. If, for example, the GMC has gotten surprised from behind or it's running away. The next variant is very similar. This is the T30 howitzer motor carriage, an M3 half-track with a 75mm pack howitzer jammed in. Just like the GMC, this is a stopgap slap-a-gun on a half-track while we wait for something better vehicle that the US Army used before it got the M8 HMC. The concept is that of a self-propelled gun. If the infantry run into trouble, the half-track can roll up and blast the offending enemy position with 75mm HE rounds. This is reflected in the ammo loadout. The T30 carries 48 high explosive rounds and 4 white phosphorus rounds. It's not an anti-tank weapon, it's a small artillery piece, but in case of emergencies it carries 7 high explosive anti-tank rounds. The heat round relies on a shaped charge for armour penetration, so the low muzzle velocity of the short-barreled 75 is neatly sidestepped, but actually hitting things is a little more difficult compared to an actual AT gun because of the generally higher trajectory. If it connects though, the 75mm heat is capable of taking out something like a Panzer IV from the front, so it's not exactly useless. Interestingly, if you do have a T30 HMC on the field, it will pop up as an artillery option and you can use it in the indirect fire role by calling for fire. Your average combat mission map is very small from an artillery perspective, so although the HMC mounts a howitzer, it's still firing at a very flat angle at these kinds of short ranges, and this presents some problems. Anything closer than a kilometre is either going to be masked by intervening terrain features or in line of sight for much more effective direct fire anyway. Beyond 1,000 meters, the trajectory is getting high enough to pass over things like trees and buildings, so it is an option, but I'd probably favour using direct fire or a different asset like mortars or off-map artillery, because it's just less hassle. Aside from the difference in the primary armament, the rest of the vehicle follows the same general layout of the gun motor carriage, with a driver up front, 3 men serving the main gun, and a gunner for the rear-facing pedestal-mounted ubiquitous 50 caliber. Our final 2 variants are mortar carriers, the M4A1 and M21 MMCs for mortar carriage. The M4A1 came first. It's an M2 half-track with an 81mm mortar in the back. The original M4 wasn't designed for the mortar to be fired from inside the vehicle. It was just supposed to cart the mortar team around and they would have to dismount and set up the weapon when they needed to use it. Although it was possible to fire from the rear of the half-track, this was supposed to only be done in emergencies, as the recoil did not do the floor of the vehicle any favours. This obviously being less than ideal, the M4A1 introduced a proper mount and a reinforced floor. The mortar fires up and out of the back of the vehicle with a pretty limited traverse, so the half-track itself is going to be doing the bulk of the aiming. Firing to the rear has the advantage of a quick getaway if you're doing some shoot and scoot direct fire or the enemy pops up too close for comfort. For self-defense, the M4A1 also mounts, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, a 50 caliber M2 Browning. This is on a skate rail over the cab and the vehicle carries 700 rounds for it. The M21 was a further development of the concept, with the mortar now mounted in the much roomier M3 facing forwards. Again, we've got a 50 cal with 700 rounds, though this time it's on a pedestal mount behind the mortar tube, so it's slightly more versatile than the skate mount on the M4A1. Both of these mortar carriers come in 2 parts, the vehicle itself with a single crewman in the driver's seat and a bog standard infantry medium mortar team. We're mostly interested in the vehicle here, but it's worth noting that the M1 81mm mortar has a minimum range of 75 meters and a maximum range of 3000. The advantage of the mortar carriers lies in speed. Obviously they're faster than a mortar team walking around on foot, but they also don't need to stop and set the weapon up to fire when they're in the carrier because it's all ready. The mortar team is also behind some armour protection, which is not fantastic, but it's better than the issue shirts that the infantry are carrying. And the half-track carries a radio, so you don't need to worry about the mortar team falling out of contact. But most significantly, the MMCs carry a load of extra ammunition. Dismounted, the mortar teams only carry 22 bombs, 20 high explosive and 2 Willy Pete, but the mortar half-track carries an additional 86 high explosive and 10 white phosphorus bombs in the back, making a total of 107 and 12 respectively. Your standard infantry mortar team with its attendant ammo bearers only bring 55 in total, so the mortar carriers have more than twice as much ammunition. which obviously has some advantages. Finally, with regards to the M4A1 and the M21, they cannot be purchased in the single vehicles tab. They are only available in armoured infantry battalions from the armoured infantry tab, being found in the Mortar platoon for the HQ company. So if you fancy bringing one along, the command and control can get a little bit complicated if you're not going down the armoured infantry route. In terms of points cost, at standard values, meaning regular and no other modifiers, the infantry carriers are all clustered in the early 70s, depending mostly on the armament. The M15 A1 and the M16 cost 93 and 80 points respectively, the GMC costs 111, the HMC costs bang on 100, and the two mortar carriers cost 72 and 73. But realistically, they're functionally more expensive because you have to purchase the actual mortar team with them. Overall, they're all pretty cheap individually, but for things like armoured infantry platoons where you're going to be needing them in fours, the cost can escalate quite quickly. Different variants pass into service at different times, and some of them pass out of service when they get replaced, so the availability and rarity cost of variants does change over time and between theatres in a way that is far too complicated to go into for a video that is already much longer than I ever intended it to be. Can't wait for the German half-tracks. Tactically speaking, I think the best way to conceptualize any of these half-tracks is as trucks. They are not really frontline vehicles, at least not in the sense of having the ability to hang around getting shot at. For the infantry carriers, they are not infantry fighting vehicles, they are battle taxis. They are much better suited to bringing the infantry to where they need to be than they are at actually fighting once they get there. The machine guns, and especially the 50s, can be very effective in the right circumstances, particularly if they're massed and they can be used to provide fire support for the pixel tribun, but whether this is a good idea or not depends an awful lot on the situation. The gunners are universally exposed and vulnerable, and the half-tracks themselves do not react well to even rifle fire, so there's quite a lot of risk involved in using the half-tracks aggressively like this. The same goes for the more specialised variants. The mortar carrier and AA half-tracks can contribute in their main roles without ever entering line of sight of the enemy, but using them or the gun half-tracks for direct fire is an exercise in shoot and scoot, defilade, or otherwise controlling and limiting exposure unless you're confident that you have the fire superiority to get away with it, or you've dealt with the enemy's anti-vehicle capability and you can engage outside of effective range of small arms. The AA half-tracks in particular are quite good for wheeling out in the mopping up phase because they can put an atrocious amount of firepower into the enemy's last-ditch positions. The greatest strength of the half-tracks in general, though, is their speed and mobility compared to the infantry. Having the ability in the first few turns to throw an armoured infantry platoon forward to seize key terrain or keep them back as a quick acting reserve on the defence is extremely useful, and you can get a lot of flexibility out of this. On the flip side, some of the roles performed by the more specialised variants may well be better performed by other units depending on the situation. So, for example, the M3 GMC with the 75mm gun is more expensive, harder to hide, and has a slower rate of fire than a 57mm anti-tank gun, whilst being cheaper but less heavily armed and armoured than a Sherman, which you may get an awful lot more use out of. This is all very context dependent, and realistically, if you want to have a fast-moving, flexible US force in the World War II titles, it's gonna have half-tracks in it. That then is a rough guide to combat missions allied half-tracks. It's a big topic and there's probably stuff that I've missed in there, but regardless, hope you guys all enjoyed this and found it useful. I'll catch you in the next video.